Last week we talked about how good a year 1987 was for hard rock music. We talked about Guns N' Roses. We talked about Whitesnake. We talked about The Cult. But fear not, 1987 is also an equally good year for heavy metal. Find out all about it next. Welcome, metal enthusiasts, to another episode of The Metal Dude Abides. Tonight, we are taking a look at one of my favorite years in the history of hard rock and heavy metal, 1987. Now, as I was explaining in my video last week, if you haven't seen it, check it out. We talked about the best hard rock music of the year. This week, we're going to be in part 2 of this series. Now we're taking a look at the best heavy metal of 1987. Now, the premise around this show is simple. We are taking a look at the Grammy Awards. Now, the Grammy Awards, why is this year significant? 1987 is the very last year that the Grammys would not formally recognize hard rock and heavy metal. So we've been doing this show from 1967 through 1987, 20 years of hard rock and heavy metal, when it was not even appreciated or recognized by the Grammys. But in 1988, we're going to start looking at what the Grammys did once they started to recognize heavy metal. So the series gets a little bit different. You'll see some pretty major changes to the format. But enough technicalities. I told you this was a great year for heavy metal. Let's prove it. Let's start with Newcomer of the Year. Best newcomer in the heavy metal field is a pretty interesting and diverse field. The first band I want to highlight is the band Death, and they have their first album, Scream Bloody Gore. Now listen, it's kind of interesting. Death has become one of those legendary bands because they were really setting that trend. Death metal, many people say, starts right here on this album. Now, the only problem is at this point, the production on this album is, to say the least, abysmal. But I adore this album. I love the aggressiveness, the guitars, the drums. Everything is just going to 11. I really like it. It kind of reminds me in a weird way, like a very poorly produced version of Kill 'Em All. It's like the first time you hear this, you're blown back at just how powerful this album is. It's unfortunate that the record labels at that time weren't able to give some of these newer extreme metal bands the proper production, because I think it might have made that jump. Instead of heavy metal going through the dark ages and having to come back out of it the other side, it might have just transitioned into more of an extreme metal trajectory. But again, you have to get past some pretty lousy production issues on this first Death album. The second band is one of my favorite thrash metal bands of all time, Testament. Now, we all know that there is a big four, and I agree that Metallica and Megadeth are the big two. But if you were to ask me, what's my third favorite, and a band that's close enough to the beginning of the thrash movement that they could be technically considered one of those original pioneers, my band would be Testament. Now, again, this is their very first album. They get better. So neither of those bands is going to win Newcomer of the Year. That, my friends, is going to go to a brand new band with a very familiar face. UDO, the new band formed by Udo Dirkschneider, is going to put out an album called Animal House. Now, there's an interesting story behind this. Udo Dirkschneider, for those of you, of course, who know, was the lead singer of a very successful traditional heavy metal band by the name of Accept. They had put together banger after banger, and they'd come close to breaking it big on albums like Balls to the Wall. but they had kind of run into a little bit of a commercial success issue, and their last album, Russian Roulette, didn't do very well at all. So the band is literally making this album, this Animal House album, when they decide this isn't working. They scrapped the entire project, fired their lead singer, Udo Dirkschneider, and as a consolation prize to Udo, said, you know what, no hard feelings. If you want this album, it's yours. They went out and found another singer who might be more aesthetically pleasing, if you will. Big, tall, really fit more into the hair metal. Now, except dropped like a weight into the ocean, no one liked their album Eat the Heat. But I say to you that this album, Animal House, is one of the best heavy metal albums you're ever going to hear. And I will contend to my dying day that if Accept had just stayed the course and produced this album, they would have had a major hit on their hands and might have jumped in to that upper echelon. Of course, we'll never know for sure, but who benefited from this? Udo Dirkschneider, who is still a legendary performer who has been with this band now for, well, let's do the math, 40 years, based on this very first album, is still his absolute best. Congratulations to Udo and the band UDO. They are our heavy metal newcomer of the year. Now let's talk about Best Instrumental Performance of 1987. When I set out to do this whole Grammy analysis thing, I set up some rules. But as they say, rules are always meant to be broken. I'm not a big fan of, producing an album 20 years later, a live album 20 years later from when the original material was produced, and saying, look, this is the best thing since sliced bread. I've seen over and over the Grammy Awards giving awards to like Black Sabbath for the song Iron Man from a live performance when they didn't give credit to Black Sabbath for Iron Man when they wrote the darn song. So you might think this is a little bit hypocritical, but I'm going to give the 1987 Heavy Metal Instrumental Award to the entire album from Ozzy Osbourne, Tribute. Yes, this is an album that was released after Randy Rhoads is passed on. It is, as it says in the title, a tribute. But two things. Number one, we're still talking, this is we're talking of 5 years, not a long time. And this is literally the only live performance we ever heard from Randy Rhoads. So I'm going to kind of bend my own rules. I don't know if I'm breaking them, but I'm going to bend them here because it was so wonderful to finally get to hear all of those classic Ozzy Osbourne songs and even a couple of Black Sabbath songs performed live by one of the greatest guitarists of all time, Randy Rhoads. So Instrumental of the Year 1987 goes to the album Tribute by Ozzy Osbourne. Now that year, the Grammys had an interesting choice. They went with the legend, Frank Zappa. Now, first and foremost, I think Frank Zappa is one of the most interesting people in the history of music. I like Frank Zappa's music, but mostly for the inappropriate humor and just bizarre lyrics, more so than his actual, musicianship. However, I also know many people and guitar aficionados who know much more about guitar playing than I do, have always said Frank Zappa is an absolute genius when it comes to guitar work. And so I have no problem seeing Frank Zappa finally win an award for Best Instrumental. The only nitpicky thing I have about this is I prefer Frank Zappa on guitar. I think that's where Frank Zappa really got his credence, his reputation, where he gets his bona fides, if you will. At this point, this is, by the way, the last Frank Zappa studio album, as he gets ill shortly after this and passes tragically. The only thing I have about it giving him this award way back here in 1987 is he's largely given up the guitar and he's kind of experimenting on some early digital synthesizers at the time. I've mentioned this on my channel before. I think the synthesizer music of the 80s wasn't that phenomenal. And so I would have much preferred them giving that award to Frank Zappa when he was still doing legendary things on the guitar as opposed to this version of Frank Zappa. So for that reason, I will also give the award across the board to Ozzy Osbourne album Tribute. Let's go on to Best Vocal Performance. '87 heavy metal vocal performance goes to Manowar, Violence and Bloodshed. I do not know how Eric Adams is not a household name. One of the absolute best vocalists in the history of heavy metal. I know Manowar kind of took their ball and went home many, many moons ago and departed for Europe and rarely graces the States these days. But I will say this. Manowar, at this point in their career, one of the legendary bands, and this just so happens, okay, Warriors of the World is my favorite Manowar song, as it is most people's. What a great song. But if I had to pick a second Manowar song, it's right here, Violence and Bloodshed, and the reason why, Eric Adams' voice on this will shatter glass if you leave it unattended. It is a phenomenal vocal performance. Manowar, again, kind of slipped into the archives a bit. You may not be as familiar with them as you should be. If you want to, and you're not familiar with Manowar, I suggest starting right here. Violence and Bloodshed, one of the all-time great vocal performances in the history of heavy metal. Now, I don't always give out awards for best female heavy metal vocal performance, but in 1987, you bet I'm going to give it to Doro for her song and one of my all-time favorite Warlock songs, All We Are. Doro is kind of, to me, the first lady of heavy metal. She has always had that kind of raspy vocals. I think is very underrated. She gets into a little bit of a dispute with her record company over the band Warlock and kind of loses some momentum. But right here, I think she was on the cusp of really breaking big. One of the best female performers in the history of heavy metal. Love Doro Pesch to death. Now, the Grammys that year had another interesting selection. And one that, quite frankly, I think would rate very poorly. They gave the award to Bruce Springsteen for his song Tunnel of Love. Now, I've often commented that it seems like when it comes to vocal performances, the Grammys isn't looking at vocals as much as maybe there's a rock song from a male performer who sings. Because, ladies and gentlemen, whatever you think of Bruce Springsteen, I've heard many people lavishly talk about his great live shows. All the energy, whatever you like about Bruce Springsteen, one thing I don't even think the most hardcore Bruce Springsteen fans would say is that he has great vocals. He doesn't enunciate very well. It's almost like he's got marbles in his mouth, in my opinion. He's one of the weakest vocal performers to break big in the 80s. So I'm shocked that the Grammys would ever select Bruce Springsteen for Best Vocal of the Year. Just as an aside, if you don't like heavy metal or whatever, I don't know what you're watching this show for, but, Bob Seger comes out that year. Bob Seger's got a great voice. Bruce Springsteen doesn't have a great voice. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you want just textbook, beautiful singing, look throughout the heavy metal world of the 80s. This same year, Dio has a song. As you know, I'm partial to Ronnie James Dio's voice. All the Fools Sailed Away. What a legendary song. What a legendary vocal performance. But if you want just sheer power, forget the boss. You know who the real boss is? Eric Adams and Manowar. They're not only going to take home Best Heavy Metal Vocal Performance of the Year, they're going to take it across the board. Eric Adams one of the most underrated vocalists in heavy metal history. All right, let's get to the biggies. Best heavy metal song and album of 1987. Best heavy metal song of 1987. Limiting this to 5 nominations was next to impossible, but here we go. Our first nominee, Anthrax, with their song Indians. You know, there's a lot made about, the great breakdowns in heavy metal today. This is one of the first that just really catches your eye. In the middle of Indians, Joey Belladonna yells out, "War Dance." You talk about, you better be ready to strap on tight for that mosh pit. It's going to get crazy. One of the all-time best Anthrax songs right here. Our first nominee, Indians. Our second nominee, Armored Saint, Chemical Euphoria. You could say that this is Armored Saint's version of Master of Puppets, as it talks about the dangers of drug abuse. What a epic song. John Bush, one of my favorite vocalists, has never sounded it better. Check it out. Our second nominee, Chemical Euphoria by Armored Saint. Our third song comes from the band Grim Reaper, and it's called Rock You to Hell. I think this could have been a really big hit for them, except I think it sounds too much like See You in Hell, which was a big hit off their first album. So I think maybe it confused people. I don't know. See You in Hell was a much bigger hit. Grim Reaper's first album was a much bigger hit. But for my money, this song, Rock You to Hell, and their third album are much better. So if you were confused by this and went, wait a minute, isn't that the... Try Rock You to Hell. It is also probably a direct assault on the PMRC's censorship movement. Really strong anti-censorship lyrics in this song. Love it to death. Our fourth nominee, Savatage, with their song Hall of the Mountain King. This is really... Savatage gets off to a fast start, but kind of stumbles around or having issues with their record label. They really knock it out of the park on this one. I cannot believe that this song isn't based on the Hobbit character Thorin Oakenshield, the king under the mountain, but it is a classic as far as if you look at the power metal genre. You can't get any better than this, Hall of the Mountain King. And our fifth and final nominee comes from the band UDO, Udo and the Boys, who put together an amazing ballad by the name of In the Darkness. I am going to... It's hard to say, of all the great heavy metal ballads that there are in the world, that this one might be considered my favorite, but it has to be considered one of the leading contenders to be one of my favorites. Udo Dirkschneider does not have what you would call the classic great voice, but the emotion he puts into this song, I never would have believed that they could put out a ballad so dark and yet so beautiful. Our fifth nominee, In the Darkness. And the winner is... I feel a little bit like a broken record here, because this competition is so close. You could make a legitimate argument for every one of these songs to be Song of the Year. But I'm going to go with the ballad this year, 1987, Heavy Metal Song of the Year, In the Darkness by UDO. I get it. Sometimes you have to take a chance. Go with the ballad. Udo Dirkschneider. I can't believe how beautiful and heavy and dark this song is all at the same time. It is an absolute brilliant song. And I do believe, once again, if Accept had stayed the course and they had produced this album and had the backing of the record companies and their name recognition, this could have been a huge hit at a time when the industry was looking for that ballad. You look at, in just a year, how I would consider it a ballad, like one just absolutely took over the charts. I think Accept had a big hit on their hands and punted. It's too bad. Now, the Grammys that year, Linda Ronstadt with a song Somewhere Out There. Now, if you're not familiar with Linda Ronstadt, that's probably okay. She was kind of a big performer back in the 70s. And I mention that only because Linda Ronstadt winning a Grammy Award in the 1980s really makes the whole Grammy experience feel a little bit outdated. Sometimes you do wonder if the people picking the Grammys have a calendar, because Linda Ronstadt's time had kind of come and gone. She was, of course, famously in a relationship with California Governor Moonbeam Jerry Brown, and like I said, had really hit her peak, I'm going to say way back in like the mid-70s. It wasn't even the late 70s, folks. So really surprised to see this here. I'll be honest, I'm not familiar with this song in particular, nor am I particularly interested in listening to it. But when you look at the amazing songs that were coming out in both album and hard rock, I mean, we talked last week about Still of the Night, Welcome to the Jungle, and now you start looking at these heavyweights in the heavy metal department. There's no way Linda Ronstadt should win Song of the Year. Now I'm going to go back in time. The hard rock Song of the Year should win Song of the Year. I'm going to give it to Welcome to the Jungle. But all of these heavy metal songs should have at least been considered for nominations. They are one after another great songs. Now let's get to the granddaddy, Heavy Metal Album of the Year. Our 5 nominees for Heavy Metal Album of the Year start with Dream Evil by Dio. Now, Dio, this is the first album with new guitarist Craig Goldie. If you're not familiar with the soap opera that's going on with Dio, he's had a falling out with his original guitarist, Vivian Campbell. And the third album in the Dio collection, the previous album, Sacred Heart, had been a bit of a bomb. So I think it really hurt the momentum of Dio to have a band shakeup following kind of a stinker of an album. So I don't think Dream Evil ever gets the credit it deserves. But it is one of the best albums in the entirety of the Dio collection. Go check it out. Our second nominee, Manowar with Fighting the World. This is Manowar is really in their groove right now. This is an excellent album. We talked about the tremendous vocals by Eric Adams, Violence and Bloodshed being one of my all-time favorite Manowar songs. They also had a really funny video that actually played a little bit on MTV called Blow Your Speakers. And in that song, they are criticizing MTV for not playing a lot of the metal at that point. If you remember back in the day, this is kind of an interesting period of metal in that metal is exploding everywhere, but heavy metal's also been under attack on the MTV from people like the PMRC, but also from people like Quincy Jones, who were saying, hey, wait a minute, all of this metal being played is a little bit racist. You should have many more black artists on MTV. So heavy metal was kind of getting squeezed on both sides, especially really heavy metal like Manowar. So they gave a little knock on MTV in this one. It's a classic. Our third nominee, Motorhead, with their album Rock and Roll. There are so many good songs on this album, but one I want to bring in particular. Eat the Rich is one of the legendary Lemmy songs in that Lemmy really knows how to turn a phrase. Lemmy can write some of the most hilarious lyrics that you're ever going to hear. Eat the Rich, I believe, unless my memory is failing, there was actually made for the soundtrack for the movie Eat the Rich. There was a comedy show back in the day called The Young Ones, and the star of that show was kind of springboarded him to a little bit of fame, at least in England, and so he was the lead character in this movie Eat the Rich. Motorhead produces the perfect song for that movie. It is hilarious. If you want to listen to it, pay close attention to the lyrics. They will crack you up. But the rest of the album is also very good. Motorhead's kind of settling in to that second phase. I think after Fast Eddie left the band and Phil left the band, there was a little bit of a confusion, and there was a little bit of a lack of direction, if you will. But Motorhead's starting to get their feet back from under them. They're about to go on another little mini run of some really great albums. Our fourth nominee, we talked about them earlier, Savatage, Hall of the Mountain King. This is a unbelievably good power metal album. And really, again, Savatage had kind of been looking for that sound. They find it right here on this classic album. And finally, UDO with the amazing album Animal House, the album that Accept Let Get Away. What a crazy story. We'll never get over it. This was the biggest mistake. People, the guys from Accept probably wake up screaming in the middle of the night. How did we let that one get away? I don't know. Our fifth nominee, UDO. And the winner is Savatage, Hall of the Mountain King. I want to maybe introduce you to someone that you may not have ever heard of, Paul O'Neill. You see, Savatage was struggling. They clearly had talent. John Oliva, what a voice. Chris Oliva, what a guitar player. This was a band that was going places. But as it was in the 80s, the record labels were kind of meddling, trying to get them to sound and make a big hit. So they were kind of confused. They got off to a great start, but their last album, Fight to Rock, I don't remember, it was kind of a dud. The talent was still there, but the songwriting, they were trying to be, Def Leppard, right? It wasn't great. Savatage was about to just call it a day. But they ran into a fellow by the name of Paul O'Neill that saw the talent of Savatage and said, let's see what we can do together. And together, Savatage right here is about to go on a roll of epic proportions. For those of you who may or may not know, I am a huge Savatage fan. And the rest of this, from this point forward, they are going to be major players, major contenders for every award because their albums are going to be one after another excellent. I don't think Savatage ever completely recovered from the earlier missteps. So if for whatever reason you miss Savatage or have heard about them but went, I don't know, there's phases to this, right? They start off, again, very power metal band, very traditional heavy metal, maybe even you could say a little bit of doom metal. But they move into kind of more of a progressive, almost symphonic metal. So their sound changes throughout their era. So just because you've heard something recently from them doesn't mean it epitomizes their whole run. They're one of those bands you got to go through the whole catalog to really understand the fullness of their greatness. One other thing. Over the years, I kind of lost track of Savatage a little bit. And so my friends invited me to this Christmas concert called Trans-Siberian Orchestra. And I was like, sounds fun. Absolutely loved it. Heavy metal Christmas. You betcha. Great vocals. Great, guitar solos. This thing was just my cup of tea. But I found something really interesting while I'm sitting there watching this performance. Some drunk guy or happy guy, whatever, 3 rows back, keeps yelling Savatage through the whole concert. Now, I love Savatage, but I have no idea what the connection is between Savatage and what I'm watching. So, of course, by this point, we have the internet. I come home, I do some searching, and I went, holy cow, Savatage basically became Trans-Siberian Orchestra. So if you like Trans-Siberian Orchestra, while it's a completely different style of music, I want to go back and check out Savatage, one of my favorite bands of all time. Now, the Grammys that year, I've got to give them credit. They actually pick a really good album, not just for Album of the Year, but for Rock Performance of the Year. Remember, they've kind of started this whole Performance of the Year, which it could be an album, it could be a song. But this year, they made Album of the Year and Rock Performance of the Year by U2, The Joshua Tree. I must admit, I am a huge U2 fan. One of my favorite moments, we went to see U2 at concert in the old Mile High Stadium in Denver, 72,000 strong, and lo and behold, one of those lucky draws, I got floor seats for this thing. And at one point or another, for those of you who may or may not know or care, Mile High Stadium was a football stadium that was originally designed to be both football and baseball. So the entire structure on one side was could be moved by putting it on, can you believe this, like an inch of water, and they would just float it back or bring it forward. That's why when the Colorado Rockies came to Denver, they were able to float those stands back, and voila, you have a baseball stadium. Pretty cool technology for people thinking way back in the 70s. But for those of you who are not familiar, if you went to a Broncos game or whatnot, and those fans started getting rowdy, those stands would move because they're not anchored into anything. They're floating on this thing of water. So we're watching the U2 concert, and at one point we're between bands, and they're starting to get the music a little bit hyped. U2's about to hit the stage, and they play the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Give It Away Now. And I just happened to look over because, of course, the lights are still on. People are finding their seats. And the stands are literally, bouncing, I don't know, 4 or 5 feet. Like, they are just doing this number. And I'm thinking, what an incredible night. U2 came out on stage. Fantastic show. Anyway, love U2. However, I will again say to Grammys, fine, you can pick Joshua Tree. Great album, no problems. But here's my quarrel with this. U2's been good for an entire decade at this point. They came out in 1980, I believe, with Boy and then War and then, on and on. And here we are 7 years later, right? They're finally getting recognized. And it just goes back to what I've always said about the Grammys. They're not really good at finding talent. They're good at acknowledging once that talent has become popular. That's one of my biggest complaints with the Grammys. They didn't give U2 a sniff until they get to this point. Now they're one of the biggest bands on planet Earth. From this point forward, U2's a household name. Everybody knows about U2. But the Grammys never recognized them until they were that household name, that universally popular. And in fact, then they start lavishing Grammy Awards on them left and right. Listen, I love U2, but after the Joshua Tree, they probably had, maybe a couple songs here and there were good, but they pretty much, that run up, that first 7 years, to me, much better era. Maybe you can even swing Achtung Baby in there. But after Achtung Baby, you're really having to squint to say this is the best music that U2's ever produced. But it's yet that era that the Grammys recognize. And that's the problem with the Grammys. They didn't recognize U2 as a young, up-and-coming, talented band. They kind of waited till they were past their prime and then lavished awards on them. When we do this reviewing of the Grammys, we want them to be finding the talented bands that are coming up that are talented. Like, I don't know, Guns N' Roses. Like, I don't know, Sabotage. These are the bands that are making great music right now and have, in the case of Sabotage anyway, years of brilliance ahead of them. So, again, fine, give it to U2, but shame on you Grammys for waiting 7 years to finally recognize U2, and shame on you for giving them a ton of Grammys long past their prime when they probably should have been going to other bands that you should have been recognizing in their day. And that's my rant. Now, if you didn't see the first part of this episode, the Hard Rock edition, go back and check it out. I think you'll love it. We're going to talk a lot about Guns N' Roses and Whitesnake and The Cult and a whole lot of great bands. So check that out as well. In the meantime, I do want to mention, as I said earlier in the episode, this is the last year the Grammys do not recognize hard rock and heavy metal. So our Fixing the Grammy series is going to look a lot different in 1988 because we're going to start critiquing the Grammys actually recognizing heavy metal and hard rock. I don't know if we're better off being ignored or being recognized. You'll see there's some pretty uneven results upcoming. The best way to catch the new format is to subscribe to the channel, be alerted to our new content. We're going to be doing a couple of specials as we kind of shift over to that new model. We're going to do a special on Halloween. We're going to do a couple of discographies. We're going to talk about our best songs and albums of this year, 2025. So we probably won't be in 1988 for a while. So you want to subscribe so when we get there, you'll be alerted. In the meantime, this is the Metal Dude signing off. Take care.